and welcome back. Just a reminder, this is being shared with permission from Scholastic and will be taken down in the beginning of June. We're going to start off with our riddle of the day. The riddle of the day from yesterday was, I'm tall when I'm young, but short when I'm old. What am I? The answer is a candle. The riddle for today is, what has hands but cannot clap? As you think about that, I'm going to go ahead and read our two chapters for today. We're reading chapters 39 and 40. Chapter 39 is called Maddie and Az. David took the board over the ridge so fast that Tali thought she would tumble off. She sank her fingertips into David's jacket to steady herself, thankful for the new shoes' grippy soles. Listen, David, the boss fought them. That's why they killed them. Killed him. My parents would have fought too. She bit her lip and focused her whole mind on staying on the board. When they reached the closest approach of the hover path to his parents' house, David jumped off and dashed down the slope. Tali realized that the board still wasn't fully charged, and it took a moment to unfold it before following, in no hurry to discover what the specials had done to Maddie and Az. But when she thought of David finding his parents on her own, Tali ran after him. It took her long minutes to find the path in the dense brush. 2 nights ago they had come in the dark and from a different direction. She listened for David, but couldn't hear anything. But then the wind shifted, and the smell of smoke came through the trees. Burning the house hadn't been easy. Set into the mountain, the stone walls and roof had provided no fuel for the fire, but the attackers had evidently thrown something inside that contained its own fuel. The windows were blown outwards, glass littering through the grass in front of the house, nothing left at the door but a few charred scraps swinging on their hinges in the breeze. David stood in front, unable to cross the threshold. Stay here, Tali said. She stepped through the doorway, but the air overpowered her for the first moments. Morning light slanted in, picking out floating particles of ash. They swirled around Tali, little spiral galaxies set into motion by her passage. The blackened floorboards crumbled under her feet and burned away to bare stone in some places. But some things had survived the fire. She remembered the marble statuette from her first visit, and one of the rugs hanging on the wall remained mysteriously untouched. In the parlor a few teacups stood out white against the charred furniture. Tali picked one up, realizing that if these cups had survived, a human body would leave more than traces. She swallowed. If David's parents had been there, whatever was left of them would be easy to find. Deeper in the house, in a small kitchen, city-made pots and pans hung from the ceiling, their warped and blackened metal still shining through in a few spots. Tali noted a bag of flour and a few pieces of dried fruit that somehow made her empty stomach growl. The bedroom was last. The stone ceiling was low and angled, the paint cracked and blackened from the heat of a raging fire. Tali felt the heat still rising from the bed, the straw mattress and thick quilts fuel for the conflagration. But Az and Maddie had not been there. There was nothing in the room that could have been human remains. Tali sighed with relief and made her way back outside, rechecking every room. She shook her head as she stepped through the door. Either the specials took them or they got away. David nodded, pushed past her. Tali collapsed on the ground and coughed, her lungs finally protesting against the smoke and dust particles she had inhaled. Her arms and hands were black with soot, she realized. When David came out, he held a long knife. Hold out your hands. What? The handcuffs. I can't stand them. She nodded and held out her hands. He carefully threaded the blade between the flesh and plastic, working it back and forth to saw the cuffs. A solid minute later, he pulled the knife away in frustration. It's not working. Tali looked closer. The plastic had hardly been marked. She hadn't seen how the specials had snipped her handcuffs in two from behind her, but it had only taken a moment. Perhaps they used a chemical trigger. Maybe it's made of some kind of aircraft plastic, she said. Sometimes that stuff is stronger than steel. David frowned. So how did you get them apart? Tali opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She could hardly tell him that the specials had released her themselves. And why do you have 2 cuffs on each wrist, anyways? She looked down dumbly, remembering that they had handcuffed her first when she was captured, and then again in front of Dr. Cable, before taking her to look for the pendant. I don't know, Tali managed. I guess they double-cuffed us. But breaking out was easy. I cut them on a sharp rock. That doesn't make sense. David looked at the knife. Dad always said this was the most useful thing he'd ever brought from the city. It's all high-tech alloys and monofilaments. She shrugged. Maybe the part that joined the cuffs was made out of different stuff. He shook his head, not quite accepting her story. Finally, he shrugged. Oh well, we'll just have to live with them. But one thing's for sure, my parents didn't get away. How do you know? He held up the knife. If he'd had any warning, my dad would have never left without this. The specials must have surprised them completely. Oh, I'm sorry, David. At least they're alive. He looked into her eyes, and Tally saw that his panic had faded. So, Tally, do you still want to go after them? Yes, of course. David smiled. Good. He sat next to her, looking back at the house and shaking his head. It's funny. Mom always warned me that this would happen. They tried to prepare me the whole time I was growing up. And for a long while I believed them, but after all those years I started to wonder. Maybe my parents were just being paranoid. Maybe, like Runaways always said, special circumstances wasn't real. Tally nodded silently, not trusting herself to speak. And now that it's happened, it seems even less real. I'm sorry, David. But he could never know how sorry. Not until she'd helped save his parents, at least. Don't worry, we'll find them. One stop to make first. Where? As I said, my parents were ready for this. Ever since they founded the smoke, they made preparations. Like making sure you could take care of yourself, she said, touching the soft leather of his handmade jacket. He smiled at her, rubbing soot from her cheek with one finger. They did a lot more than that. Come with me. In a cave near the house, with the opening so small that Tally had to crawl inside on her belly, David showed her the catch-up gear his parents had tended for 20 years. There were water purifiers, direction finders, lightweight clothes, and sleeping bags. By Smoky standards, an absolute fortune in survival equipment. The four hoverboards had old-fashioned styling, but they were fitted with the same features as the one Dr. Cable had supplied Tally with for the trip to the smoke, and there was a package of spare belly sensors sealed against moisture. Everything was of the highest quality. Wow, they did plan ahead. Always, he said. He picked up a flashlight and tested its beam against the stone. Every time I came here to check on all this stuff, I would imagine this moment. A million times I planned exactly what I would need. It's almost like I imagined it so much that it had to happen. It's not your fault, David. If I had been here, you'd be in a special circumstances hover car right now, handcuffs and not likely to rescue anyone. Yeah, and instead I'm here, he looked at her. But at least you are too. You're the one thing I never imagined all those times, an unexpected ally. She managed to smile. He pulled out a big waterproof bag. I'm starving. Tally nodded, and her head swam for a moment. She hadn't eaten dinner since 2 nights before. David rummaged through the bag. Plenty of instant food. Let's see. Veggie rice, curry noodles, sweet balls, pad thai. Any favorites? Tally took a deep breath. Back to the wild. Anything but spag bowl. The oil plague. David and Tally left at sunset. Each of them rode two hoverboards. Pressed together like a sandwich, the paired boards could carry twice as much weight, most of it in a saddlebag slung on the underside. They'd packed everything useful they could find, along with the magazines the boss had saved. Whatever happened, there would be no point in returning to the smoke. Tally took the river down the mountain carefully, the extra weight swaying below her like a ball and chain around both ankles. At least she was wearing crash bracelets again. Their journey would follow a path very different from the one Tally had taken here. That route had been designed to be easy to follow, and had included a helicopter ride with the Rangers. This one wouldn't be as direct. Overloaded as they were, Tally and David couldn't manage even short distances on foot. Every inch of the journey had to be over hoverable land and water, no matter how far it took them out of their way. And after the invasion, they would be giving the cities a wide berth. Fortunately, David had made the journey to and from Tally City dozens of times, alone and with inexperienced Uglies in tow. He knew the rivers and the rails and the ruins and the natural veins of ore, and had dozens of escape routes he'd devised in case he was ever pursued by city authorities. 10 days, he announced when they started, if we ride all night and stay low during the day. Sounds good, Tally said, but she wondered if that would be soon enough to save anyone from the operation. Around midnight the first night of travel, they left the brook that led down to the bald-headed hill, and followed the dry creek bed through the white flowers. It took them to the edge of a vast desert. How did we get through that? David pointed at the dark shapes rising up from the sand, a row of them receding into the distance. Those used to be towers, connected by steel cables. What for? They carried electricity from the wind farm to one of the old cities. Tali frowned. I didn't know that the Rusties used wind power. They weren't all crazy, just most of them, he shrugged. You've got to remember, we're mostly descended from Rusties, and we're still using their basic technology. Some of them must have had the right idea. The cable still lay buried in the desert, protected by the shifting sands and the near total absence of rainfall. In spots they had broken or rusted through, so Tally and David had to ride carefully, eyes glued to the board's metal detectors. When they reached a gap they couldn't jump, they would unroll a long piece of cable David carried and walk the boards along it, guiding them like reluctant donkeys across some narrow footbridge before rolling it up again. Tally had never seen a real desert before. She had been taught in school that they were full of life, but this one was like the desert she had imagined as a littlie, featureless humps stretching out into the distance, one after another. Nothing moved but slow snakes of sand borne by the wind. She only knew the name of one big desert on the continent. Is this Mojave? David shook his head. This isn't nearly that big, and it isn't natural. We're standing where the white weed started. Tally whistled. The sand seemed to go on forever. What a disaster! Once the undergrowth was gone, replaced by the orchids, there was nothing to hold down the good soil. It blew away, and all that was left is sand. Will it ever be anything but desert? Sure, in 1,000 years or so. Maybe by then someone will have found a way to stop the weed from coming back. If we haven't, the process will just start all over again. They reached the rusty city around daybreak, a cluster of unremarkable buildings stranded to the sea of sand. The desert had invaded over the centuries, dunes flowing through the streets like water, but the buildings were in better shape than the other ruins Tally had seen. Sand wore away the edges of things, but it didn't tear them down as hungrily as rain and vegetation. Neither of them was tired yet, but they couldn't travel during the day, and the desert offered no protection from the sun, nor any concealment from the air. They camped in the second floor of a low factory building that still had most of its roof. Ancient machines, each as big as a hover car, stood silent around them. What is this place? Tally asked. I think they made newspapers here, David said. Like books, but you threw them away and got a new one every day. You're kidding. Not at all. And you thought we wasted trees in the smoke. Tally found a patch of sun, shining through where the roof had collapsed, and unfolded the hoverboards to recharge. David pulled out 2 packets of egg sal. What will we make? Will we make it out of the desert tonight? She asked, watching David coax the last few drops of bottled water into the purifiers. No problem. We'll hit the next river before midnight. She remembered something that Shay had said a long time ago, the first time she'd shown Tally her survival gear. Can you really pee in a purifier and then drink it, I mean? Yeah, I've done it. Tally grimaced and looked out the window. Okay, I shouldn't have asked. He came up behind her, laughing softly, placing his hands on her shoulders. It's amazing what people will do to survive, he said. She sighed. I know. The window overlooked a street side, partially protected by the encroaching desert. A few burned-out ground cars stood half-buried, their blackened frames stark against the white sand. She rubbed the handcuff bracelets still encircling her wrists. The Rusty sure wanted to survive. Every ruin I've seen, those cars are always all over, trying to get out. But they never seemed to make it. A few of them did, but not in cars. Tally leaned back into his reassuring warmth. The morning sun was hours away from burning off the chill of the desert. It's funny, at school they never talk much about how it happened. The last panic, when the Rusty world fell apart. They shrug and say that all their mistakes just kept adding up until it collapsed like a house of cards. That's only partially true. The boss had some old books about it. What did they say? Well, the Rusties did live in a house of cards, but someone gave it a pretty big shove. No one ever found out who. Maybe it was a rusty weapon that got out of control. Maybe it was people in some poor country who didn't like the way Rusties ran things. Maybe it was just an accident, like the flowers, or some lone scientist who wanted to mess things up. But what happened? A bug got loose, but it didn't infect people. It infected petroleum. Oil got infected? He nodded. Oil is organic, made from old plants and dinosaurs and stuff. Somebody made a bacterium that ate it. The spores spread through the air, and when they landed in petroleum, processed or crude, they sprouted, like a mold or something. It changed the chemical composition of oil. Have you ever seen phosphorus? It's an element, right? Yeah, and it catches on fire with contact with air. Tali nodded. She remembered playing with the stuff in chem class, wearing goggles and talking about all the tricks you could do with it. But no one ever thought of a trick that wouldn't kill some. But no one ever thought of a trick that wouldn't kill someone. Oil infected with this bacterium was just as unstable as phosphorus. It exploded on contact with oxygen, and as it burned, the spores were released in the smoke and spread on the wind, until the spores got to the next car, or airplane, or oil well and started growing again. Wow, and they used oil for everything, right? David nodded. Like those cars down there. They must have been infected as they tried to get out of town. Well, why didn't they just walk? Stupid, I guess. Sally shivered again, but not from the cold. It was hard to think of the Rusties as actual people, rather than just idiotic, dangerous, and sometimes comedic force of history. But they but there were human beings down there, whatever was left of them after a couple hundred years, still sitting in their blackened cars, as if still trying to escape their fate. I wonder why they don't tell us that in history class. They usually love any story that makes the Rusties sound pathetic. David lowered his voice. Maybe they didn't want you to realize that every civilization has its weakness. There's always one thing we depend on, and if someone takes it away, all that's left is some story in a history class. Not us, she said. Renewable energy, sustainable resources, a fixed population. The two purifiers pinged, and David left her to go get them. It doesn't have to be about economics, he said, bringing the food over. The weakness could be an idea. She turned to take her egg cell, cupping its warmth with her hands, and saw how serious he looked. So, David, is that one of the things that you thought about all those years when you imagined the smoke being invaded? Did you ever wonder what it would take to turn the cities into history? He smiled and took a big bite. It gets clearer every day. And that is the end of your chapters for the week. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.